You don't need a business degree to build a billion-dollar company. I know, because I did it twice. But let me tell you what they don't tell you about building something from nothing. They don't tell you about the fear. The nights when you're lying awake, doing the math in your head, watching your bank account drain month after month. They don't tell you that when you don't have the traditional credentials, every mistake feels heavier. Because in the back of your mind, there's always this voice saying, maybe they were right. Maybe I should have stayed in school. Maybe I should have learned how business actually works. I almost went bankrupt. Twice. The first time, I was pouring $60 million of my own money into Pixar. We were selling a computer that cost $135,000. We sold maybe 300 units total. It was bleeding money every single month. The second time, Apple was circling the drain with 90 days of cash left, and people were asking me to come back and fix it. Both times, I had no MBA, no formal business training, just stubborn belief that we could build something that mattered. Let me tell you something about credentials. In 1995, I was sitting in a room full of Disney executives. They were wearing suits. They had MBAs from Harvard and Wharton. They knew every metric, every formula, every best practice for how to make an animated film profitable. And they were all telling me that Toy Story was going to fail. Too risky, they said. Computer animation? Unproven. A full-length feature? Nobody's done it before. You're betting the entire company on technology that might not even work. And they weren't wrong to be concerned. Each frame of that movie took between 45 minutes to 30 hours to render. We had 300 people working around the clock. Every 8 seconds of dialogue took a week to complete. But here's the thing about not having a business education. You don't know what's supposed to be impossible. You just know what you want to create. Those Disney executives, they had been trained to analyze risk, minimize uncertainty, follow proven formulas. I just wanted to make something beautiful, something that had never existed before. And sometimes, that kind of naive confidence is exactly what you need. Toy Story made $373 million at the box office. The day we went public, someone turned to me and said, "Congratulations, Steve, you're a billionaire." I stepped out of the room and called my friend Larry Ellison. I said, "Larry, I made it." After 10 years of people thinking I was finished, after pouring $60 million of my own money into a computer company that couldn't sell computers, I made it. But let me back up, because I'm getting ahead of myself. And because the real lesson isn't in the success, it's in those 10 years when everyone thought I was washed up. When I got fired from Apple in 1985, I was devastated. I was 30 years old. I had built this company from nothing, and suddenly the board and the CEO I had hired, they didn't want me anymore. I felt like I had let down the previous generation of entrepreneurs. I was a very public failure. And I thought about running, just leaving the valley. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. And they said something that stuck with me. They said, "It doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next." So I started Nexty Computer. And here's what's funny about not having a business degree. I made the exact same mistakes all over again. We spent years building a computer that was too expensive, too advanced, too perfect for the market we were trying to serve. The Next Cube was beautiful. It had a magnesium case. It used optical discs. Tim Berners-Lee used it to invent the World Wide Web. But we only sold about 50,000 units in total. From a business standpoint, Nexty was a failure. My ex-colleagues from Apple, they were laughing. The press was having a field day. Steve Jobs, they said, was proof that maybe he'd just gotten lucky the first time. Maybe the real genius had been Woz, not him. But here's what I learned during those years, and it's something they don't teach in business school. Failure isn't binary. Next failed as a hardware company, absolutely. But the operating system we built, that became the foundation for everything Apple did later. OS X, iOS. The iPhone runs on code we wrote at Nexty. So was it a failure? By traditional business metrics, yes. We never made a profit selling computers. But we were building something that would eventually be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. We just didn't know it yet. And Pixar. God, Pixar almost killed me financially. I bought it from George Lucas for $10 million in 1986. $5 million went to Lucasfilm, $5 million went into the company. And then I kept writing checks, month after month, year after year. 10 million became 20 million, 20 became 40. Eventually, I had put in over $60 million of my own money. The Pixar image computer was supposed to save us. We thought hospitals would buy it for CAT scans. Government labs would use it for simulation. But at $135,000 per unit, we could barely give them away. We sold maybe 300 units total. The math was brutal. We were losing millions every year. And there was this moment, probably around 1990, where I had to make a decision. I could cut my losses, sell the company for whatever I could get, or I could keep going. And here's the thing. If I had an MBA, if I had been trained in traditional business analysis, I probably would have shut it down. Any rational analysis would have said, this is a bad investment. You've already lost tens of millions. The product doesn't have a market. Get out while you still can. But I couldn't see it that way, because I wasn't looking at Pixar as a computer company anymore. I was looking at what Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were creating in their little animation studio. These short films they were making, Luxo Junior Tin Toy, they were magical. They had something I recognized from Apple, that feeling when you create something that's never existed before. So I kept writing checks. I sold the hardware division for $2 million, basically nothing. We laid off people, we cut costs everywhere, but I kept the animation studio alive. And this is where it gets interesting, because we needed a partner. We needed Disney to fund a feature film. Disney offered us a deal, but it was terrible. They would pay for production, but they would own all the characters. We would get 12.5% of box office revenue. And they could force us to make 2 more films under the same terrible terms. Any business school professor would tell you, don't take that deal. You're giving away everything for almost nothing. But I took it, because the alternative was bankruptcy. And because sometimes when you don't have leverage, when you don't have the credentials or the track record, you have to take the terrible deal and prove yourself first. You have to earn your way to a better position. Toy Story got greenlit. And then, about halfway through production, Disney almost killed it. They watched an early cut and hated it. They said Woody was unlikable. The story was mean-spirited. They told John Lasseter to shut down production. John came to me and said, we've got 2 weeks to fix this. And I knew in that moment that everything was riding on this. If Toy Story failed, Pixar was done. I would have lost $60 million. Everyone who had doubted me would have been right. But John delivered. He completely reworked the script in 2 weeks, and when Disney saw the new version, they greenlit us to finish. Here's what I learned from all of this, and it's something they definitely don't teach you in business school. The credential that actually matters isn't on paper, it's taste. It's knowing when something is good versus when it's just good enough. Disney had all the business analysts and focus groups and formulas for making successful animated films. But they couldn't see what we were creating. They couldn't feel it. When Toy Story released, it changed everything. It wasn't just successful, it invented a new medium. Every animated film after that had to be computer generated. We didn't just make a profitable movie. We obsoleted an entire industry's way of working. And when we took Pixar public the week Toy Story opened, the stock soared. That morning when someone told me I was a billionaire, it wasn't really about the money, it was about validation. For 10 years, people had been saying I was finished, that I had lost it, that I was living in the past, trying to recapture something that was gone. And suddenly, I had proof. I could do it again. Not because I had learned the right formulas or gotten the right degree, but because I had learned to trust my gut about what mattered. When Apple asked me to come back in 1997, I almost said no. The company was 90 days from bankruptcy. They had too many products, no focus, and they'd lost their way. Most people thought it was unsavable. And I thought, what if they're right? What if I come back and it fails, and then I'm responsible for killing the company I started? But Pixar had taught me something. When you're staring at bankruptcy, when everyone thinks you're done, that's actually when you have the most freedom, because you've got nothing to lose. You can make the bold moves that would be too risky if you were trying to protect something. So I went back, and the first thing I did was kill almost everything. Apple had 15 product lines. I cut it down to 4. Everyone thought I was crazy. You can't run a company by saying no to everything. But that's exactly what I did. We killed the printers, the PDAs, all these products that were just okay. We focused on making 4 things insanely great: the iMac, the PowerBook, and later, the desktop tower and the consumer laptop. That's it. 4 products. Everyone with an MBA was telling me this was suicide. You need diversification. You need multiple revenue streams. You can't bet everything on 4 products. But here's what business schools don't teach you. Focus is everything. When you spread yourself across 15 mediocre products, you make 15 mediocre things. When you focus all your energy on 4 things, you can make them exceptional. The iMac launched in 1998. It was completely different from anything else on the market. Translucent colored plastic, no floppy drive, built-in internet connectivity. The computer industry thought we were insane. Who makes a computer without a floppy drive? But we weren't building for the computer industry, we were building for people. And people didn't care about floppy drives, they cared about getting on the internet easily. They cared about having something beautiful on their desk. We sold 2 million iMacs in the first year, Apple was profitable again, and more importantly, we had momentum. This is the part of the story everyone knows. The iPod, iTunes, iPhone, iPad. We turned Apple around completely, from 90 days of bankruptcy to one of the most valuable companies on earth. But here's what I want you to understand. The reason we succeeded wasn't because I finally learned business. I never did, really. I could barely read a balance sheet when I started. Mike Markula had to teach me everything about profit margins and inventory turns and all of that. What made Apple successful was that I understood something deeper than business. I understood people. I understood what they wanted before they knew they wanted it. Not because I did market research. Market research is useless for breakthrough products. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. I understood it because I paid attention to my own experience. What frustrated me about existing products? What made me feel delight when something worked well? Business schools teach you to analyze the market. I learned to analyze my own reactions. When I picked up a phone with a physical keyboard, I felt constrained. I knew, without being able to articulate why, that touching the screen directly would feel more natural. Every business analyst said physical keyboards were essential. Every focus group said people needed physical keys to type, but I knew they were wrong because I knew how it felt. That's taste. And you can't learn taste from a textbook. You develop it by paying attention, by caring deeply about the experience of using things, by being willing to say, this isn't good enough, even when everyone else says it's fine. People ask me all the time, how do you know when to trust your gut versus when to listen to advice? And my answer is, you have to develop your gut first. You have to put in the hours. You have to care enough to notice the details that other people miss. When we were designing the iPhone, we went through hundreds of prototypes. We built versions with physical keyboards. We built versions with styluses. We built thick ones and thin ones and ones with more buttons and fewer buttons. And at one point, we had a design that everyone thought was good enough. It worked. It checked all the boxes. We could have shipped it, but I looked at it and felt nothing. It was fine. It wasn't insanely great. And I told Joni Ive and the team, we're starting over. We need the screen to go all the way to the edge. We need it to feel like you're touching the information directly, not through an intermediary. People thought I was crazy. We'd been working on this for months. We were close to done, and I wanted to throw it all away and start over. But that's what we did. And that decision, that unwillingness to settle for good enough, that's what made the iPhone the iPhone. Business school would have taught me to calculate the cost of the delay, to weigh the risk of missing our ship date against the marginal improvement in the product. But I wasn't calculating, I was feeling. And I knew that if we shipped something that was just good enough, we'd regret it forever. Here's the thing about building a billion-dollar company without a business degree. You make different mistakes than people with MBAs. You waste money on things that don't matter. You miss obvious solutions because you don't know the standard playbook. I definitely did all of that. But you also see opportunities that trained business people miss. because you're not constrained by what you've been taught is possible. You're not following the formula. You're making it up as you go. And sometimes the fact that you don't know the rules is exactly what allows you to break them in ways that matter. The business degree people, they would have looked at the music industry in 2001 and seen a dying market being killed by piracy. They would have analyzed the economics and concluded, stay away from music, it's a disaster. But I looked at it and saw an opportunity. People loved music. They were downloading it illegally because the legal options sucked. So we built the iPod and iTunes and made it easier to do the right thing than the wrong thing. That wasn't business analysis, that was human understanding. And human understanding doesn't come from a textbook. It comes from paying attention to people, including yourself. I've hired hundreds of people over the years, and you know what I've learned? The credentials don't predict success. I've hired people with fancy degrees who couldn't ship anything. And I've hired college dropouts who changed industries. What matters is whether they have taste, whether they care, whether they can see what's missing in the world and feel compelled to create it. That's not something you can teach in a classroom. But here's the thing about not having credentials. You have to be twice as good to get taken seriously. When I was trying to convince developers to build apps for the Macintosh in the 80s, they didn't trust me because I didn't have a traditional tech background. I hadn't worked at IBM or Xerox PARC. I was just some kid who built computers in his garage. So I had to show them. I had to build something so obviously better that they couldn't ignore it. And that's actually a gift. Because when you have credentials, you can sometimes coast on reputation. But when you don't, you have to prove yourself with work. And that makes your work better. Same thing at Pixar. Disney didn't trust us because we'd never made a feature film. We were computer nerds trying to tell stories. So we had to make Toy Story so undeniably good that they couldn't dismiss us. And in doing so, we set a standard that every film after had to meet. The pressure of not having credentials forced us to be excellent, and excellence compounds. One excellent product leads to another. One successful bet gives you credibility to make the next one. By the time we launched the iPhone, we had credibility. But we'd earned it through decades of shipping great products, not through pieces of paper on a wall. So if you're sitting there thinking, I don't have the right background, I didn't go to the right schools, I don't have an MBA, good, use that. Let it motivate you to build something so good that the credentials don't matter. But also understand, it's going to be harder. You're going to have to learn things the expensive way, through mistakes. You're going to pour money into failures because you don't know better. I certainly did. $60 million into Pixar, years of losses at NextT. Those were expensive educations. But they were my educations, not someone else's case study. And because I lived through them, because I felt the pain of those mistakes, I learned the lessons in a way that stuck. That's worth something. The other thing people don't tell you, you need to be comfortable with uncertainty. People with business degrees, they've been trained to create plans, forecast outcomes, minimize risk. But breakthrough innovations don't work that way. You can't plan your way to something that's never existed before. When we started working on the iPhone, we didn't know if the technology would work. We didn't know if we could make a phone without a keyboard that people would actually want to use. We didn't know if carriers would let us control the user experience the way we needed to. There were 1,000 ways it could fail, but we believed it was possible, and we were willing to live in that uncertainty for years while we figured it out. That's not a skill they teach in business school. That's a tolerance for discomfort that you have to develop. And let me tell you about one specific moment that illustrates this. It was January 2007. We were about to announce the iPhone at Macworld, and the phone, it didn't really work yet. I mean, it worked enough to demo, but it crashed constantly. We had this very specific sequence of actions I had to follow on stage. If I deviated from that sequence, the phone would freeze or restart. The team had worked all night trying to stabilize it, and there I was, about to walk on stage and tell the world this was the future of phones. And in my pocket, I had a prototype that might crash in front of thousands of people and millions watching online. Any reasonable business person would have delayed the announcement, would have waited until the product was stable. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that seeing it, even imperfectly, would change everything, would make it real in people's minds, would give us momentum we couldn't get any other way. So I went out there, and I followed the sequence perfectly, and the demo worked, and the crowd went insane. And even though we wouldn't ship for another 6 months, even though we still had massive technical problems to solve, that announcement changed the trajectory of the company. That's the kind of calculated risk you take when you're not constrained by traditional thinking. You know, the rules say, don't announce a product until it's ready. But you also know, sometimes breaking that rule is exactly what you need to do. Now, I'm not saying ignore all advice. That's not what I'm saying at all. I learned incredibly valuable things from people who had business training. Mike Markula taught me about marketing and profit margins. Tim Cook taught me about supply chain and operations. I hired people with MBAs because they knew things I didn't. But I never let their frameworks overrule my instincts about what mattered. And that's the balance you have to strike. Learn from people who know more than you, but don't let their knowledge paralyze you. There's this thing that happens when you're surrounded by experts. They give you all the reasons why something won't work, and they're not wrong exactly. They're identifying real obstacles, real problems, but what they're missing is the unreasonable belief that you can solve those problems. When we were building the iPod, the music industry lawyers told us, you'll never get the record labels to agree to 99-cent songs. They want variable pricing. They want to control distribution. You're wasting your time. And they were right that it was hard. The negotiations were brutal. But I believed we could make it work because I understood something they didn't. The labels were desperate. Piracy was destroying them. We were offering them a life raft, so we had more leverage than they realized. A traditionally trained business person might have looked at those obstacles and given up. But I saw them as problems to solve, not reasons to quit. And that's the mindset difference. Here's another thing they don't teach in business school: the importance of storytelling. Business schools teach you to analyze data, build models, create projections. But they don't teach you how to create a narrative that makes people believe. When we launched the iPod, I didn't talk about gigabytes or processor speeds. I said, 1,000 songs in your pocket. That's a story. That's something people can imagine and want. When we launched the iPhone, I didn't talk about megapixels and RAM. I said, this is 3 revolutionary devices in one: a phone, an iPod, and an internet communicator. Are you getting it? This is one device. That's storytelling. And I learned that from being on the outside. Because when you don't have credentials, you can't rely on authority. You have to persuade. You have to paint a picture that's so compelling, people can see it too. I spent 10 years at Pixar watching John Lasseter and the team tell stories, watching how they would take an abstract idea. What if toys came to life? What if monsters powered their world with children's screams and turn it into something you could feel? That shaped how I thought about product launches. Every product needed to be a story, not just a list of features, a story about how it would change your life. And here's what's interesting. The products that failed, they were the ones where we couldn't figure out the story. The products that succeeded, they were the ones where the story was so clear we couldn't not build them. So when people ask me about building a company without a business degree, I tell them, learn to tell stories. Learn to make people see what you see, because data and analysis can tell you what is. But only stories can show people what could be. You know what else helped? Being naive. And I know that sounds crazy, but sometimes not knowing how hard something is supposed to be is an advantage. Because you try things that smarter, more educated people know are impossible. When we decided to open our own retail stores in 2001, every retail analyst said we were insane. Gateway had tried it and failed. Dell was closing stores. The smart move was to focus on online sales and existing retail partners. But I thought, people need to experience our products in person. They need to touch them, use them, understand them. And the existing retail experience was terrible. The salespeople didn't understand our products. The stores grouped computers by manufacturer instead of by what people wanted to do. So we built our own stores, and everyone said we'd fail. They calculated sales per square foot and projected losses. They had data showing it wouldn't work. But we didn't fail. Apple stores became the most profitable retail stores in the world. More revenue per square foot than Tiffany's, because we weren't building stores the way the industry built stores. We were building experiences. And I could only do that because I didn't know it was impossible. A retail expert would have told me all the reasons it wouldn't work, and they would have been convincing. But I just saw what was missing and built it. That's the gift of ignorance sometimes. You're not weighted down by everyone else's failures. Now, let me be very clear about something. I'm not romanticizing failure or ignorance. I'm not saying that education is bad or that you should be proud of not knowing things. What I'm saying is, don't let the absence of credentials stop you, and don't let other people's expertise convince you that your vision is wrong. Because here's the secret. The experts, they're often the most trapped by conventional thinking. They've been trained in what worked in the past. They've been taught to follow patterns and avoid risk. But the future doesn't look like the past. It never does. So the patterns they've learned, they're often exactly wrong for what comes next. When I was building the Macintosh in the early 80s, the computer industry was dominated by IBM and Microsoft, and everyone in the industry knew how computers were supposed to work. Command lines, technical manuals, complexity. But I had studied calligraphy in college. Just for fun, I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about proportional spacing, about what makes typography beautiful. And when we were designing the Mac, I insisted, this computer needs beautiful fonts, multiple typefaces, proportional spacing. Everyone thought I was crazy. Computers don't need beautiful fonts. That's not what they're for. But I knew that if we made text beautiful, if we made the computer feel more human, people would love it. And we did. And they did. And now every computer has beautiful typography because we proved it mattered. That insight didn't come from a business degree. It came from following my curiosity, from taking a calligraphy class because it seemed interesting, from caring about things that weren't obviously useful. So here's my advice. Follow your curiosity. Learn things that don't seem practical, because you never know when those dots will connect. When that random knowledge will give you an insight that changes everything. I took that calligraphy class because I had dropped out of college and could sit in on anything I wanted. If I had been following a traditional path, I never would have taken it. It wasn't required. It wasn't practical. It didn't lead to a job. But it led to the Mac's typography, which led to desktop publishing, which changed the entire publishing industry, all because I followed my curiosity instead of a curriculum. That's what I mean about credentials not mattering. They give you specific knowledge, but they also constrain you. They tell you what's important and what's not. And sometimes what they tell you is not important is exactly what turns out to matter most. So as you're building your company, whatever it is, pay attention to the things that interest you, even if they seem irrelevant, especially if they seem irrelevant. Because those are the insights that your competitors won't have. Those are the advantages that don't show up on anyone's resume. And when you're hiring, don't just look at credentials. Look for people who care, who have taste, who notice things. Those are the people who will help you build something that matters. I built a $2 billion company before I was 30, lost it, then built an even bigger one. Not because I had the right education, but because I cared enough to notice what was missing. And I was stubborn enough to keep going when everyone said I was wrong. That's the real lesson. Credentials open doors. But execution is what matters. And execution comes from caring, from being willing to obsess over details that no one else notices, from refusing to ship something that's just good enough. So if you don't have the credentials, don't worry about it. Just build something insanely great. The credentials are backwards looking. They tell you what you've learned. But what matters is what you're going to create. Go create something that's never existed before, something that changes how people live. And when it works, when people love it, no one will ask where you went to school. They'll just ask, how do I get one? And that's the only credential that matters.